Um, in terms of looking at US-Syrian relations, the Obama administration has engaged the Assad regime for over 2 years in distinctly different ways than its predecessor, the Bush administration. The issues themselves are the same. I can go through them: support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and other U.S.-designated terrorist organizations, foreign fire flows to Iraq, the investigation into Syria's nuclear program, peace talks with Israel, Syrian policies in Lebanon, and last but not least, in the context of today, human rights. But the difference has been in terms of priorities. Unlike the Bush administration, President Obama has placed Syrian-Israeli peace talks at the top of the list, and I think Josh talked a little bit about, or actually quite a bit about that. But there are also profound differences in how engagement has been pursued. The Bush administration did pursue engagement with Syria on a limited scale towards the end of the administration. The Obama administration prefers to talk about contentious issues with Syria in private and not in public, and the Bush administration was quite different in this regard. So when you had something that the Bush administration felt was egregious, it was talked about openly. The Obama administration does this a little bit, but by and large things are kept in private. Also, the Obama administration kept the Bush administration era negative incentives in the sanctions regime in place, but has most importantly not enacted any new ones. So the sanctions regime, as we know, what's called SALSA, is there, but any of the additional protocols or a tightening of sanctions has not occurred. Now, what's particularly interesting about that approach is that not tightening sanctions or not using more negative incentives has come in the face of Syrian policies which have deteriorated in Washington's eyes. And one would be the particularly contentious is the transfer of long-range weapons to Hezbollah. We're talking about M600s here, and the issue of Scuds, although where exactly those are remains debatable. Facilitating transfer of Iranian weapons to Hamas, which is something which we saw this last week. Damascus is stonewalling in the IAEA probe. That has to be the strangest part of this whole story. I mean, if you would have told me, I remember giving a quote to my good friend Nicholas Blanford years ago, saying I couldn't possibly think that Syria could have a nuclear program. Well, the IAEA is currently probing it and getting nowhere. Syria's participation in bringing down the Hariri government in Lebanon, and the Obama administration continues to, despite this, the Obama administration continues to emphasize Syrian-Israeli peace talks. So it talks about all the issues, but primarily point on these issues are the peace talks. This is the primary issue. A few days ago, and just to sort of bring this up to date, U.S. Ambassador Robert Ford gave an interview to Syria's Al Watan newspaper in which he said openly that Frederick Hoff, who's the regional coordinator for the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace in charge of the Syria track, is visiting Syria every few weeks and then traveling to Israel and keeping what he called channels open. Where exactly this all is at the moment is unclear, but the problem generally lies in sort of the sort of Israel and Syria coming back to the table relies on two issues. Syria wants Israel to commit to the line of June 4, 1967, and in the last round of Turkish-mediated talks, that involves 6 points along that line and getting clarification. Israel, on the other hand, wants Syrian commitments to 6 questions about its relationship with Hezbollah. And so far, it's sort of been left there. Israel, at the moment, as far as I can tell, doesn't see Syria's behavior on arms transfers to Hezbollah and most recently Hamas as an indication that Assad is really interested in peace other than rhetorically. Syria sees Netanyahu's refusal thus far to enter into talks, that it's not interested in peace, or perhaps due to domestic considerations is not capable of entering into those negotiations. I really don't know. But into this stalemate blew the winds of change from Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. There are a lot of questions whether the instability sweeping the region will change Israel or Syria's calculations for getting into peace talks. Israel might believe that it's time to explore its options, or alternatively to hunker down. Syria might do the same. I really think it's too early to tell, and I would hate to predict, just as much as I hate to predict domestic events inside of Syria, or in Israel for that matter. But whatever the case, the internal politics of Arab countries, including Syria, matters in policy circles again. And this is whether a Syrian-Israeli peace treaty is signed or not. And I think what we've witnessed is a watershed event. And I can't explain it to you in any other way than this. I think it is. I completed my master's thesis at the American University in Cairo, and I looked and I compared how the peace treaty with Israel affected political liberalization both in Egypt and Jordan. And it was in this during this investigation that I became fascinated, and I learned to understand the, I think, false distinction between what we called in political science international relations and comparative politics. The international is now blending very much with domestic affairs, and I think it becomes difficult because those of a previous generation, especially those who perhaps were steeped in a Cold War environment, are used to a more distinct, perhaps for reasons of mental economy or military decisions, are used to making this distinction. And I think very much that the two spheres are overlapping and blending together. So into this changing environment, we ask ourselves the questions: what should the U.S. do in terms of its relationship with Syria? Well, outside of the context of this argument, I've advocated on a number of occasions that the current approach is not working, and that a hybrid policy using both positive and negative incentives on all issues should be used to put President Assad into dilemmas in which his choices indicate to us which way he wants to go. This is a very big argument. Well, it's been not big, perhaps long. I won't go into it here today because of the focus of the talk. But I think generally that would be an overall way to go. But I think specifically to the issues that we've been seeing in the Arab world of the last few months, the U.S. has I think the first point is that the U.S. has every interest in being on the right side of history with the Syrian people. Thus far, the Syrian regime has refused to discuss internal issues, most notably human rights, with U.S. officials engaging in Damascus. So I think in this context, given what's happening, the U.S. should reiterate publicly its commitment to human rights and democratization in Syria, and should comment publicly in a careful and nuanced fashion on the arrests of human rights activists, bloggers, and other civil society leaders. And I think there, for those of you who have been following Syria over the last few years, I think there's a lot of lessons in what not to do that came out of the Bush administration's experience with promoting the Syrian opposition. There are a lot of lightning rod issues, ways to go about it. In any case, there are people much more skilled in this than I am to explain. Two, the U.S. should expand its efforts to build the capacity of the Syrian opposition, not just to organize and advocate for basic civil and human rights, but also to work together and not against one another. One of the great weaknesses of the Syrian opposition is its divisions. The U.S. has an interest in preparing Syrian activists to play a larger role in a more liberal Syrian political environment, or in the event that the Assad regime collapses. And I'm not predicting that it's going to, because I don't predict when regimes collapse. But in any case, we should prepare them, because we don't want to have a negative outcome should things give way.